August 8th, 1942, off the coast of Guadalcanal. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher issues a shocking order. Withdraw the only American aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Instantly, thousands of U.S. Marines are left stranded on hostile beaches, completely stripped of air cover. For decades, this single decision cemented his historical reputation as a timid commander who panicked under pressure. Yet, this was the exact same man who had just won the most decisive naval battles of the entire war. How did the admiral who halted the Japanese Empire get erased from the hero's narrative? And what actually drove his most controversial decision? To uncover what really happened in the South Pacific, we must strip away decades of sanitized, post-war mythology. This is a strict documentary investigation into the harsh, unromantic reality hidden inside classified naval directives, daily action reports, and critical fuel logs. We will examine the controversial legacy of the commander who fought the Imperial Japanese Navy to a standstill, only to be branded a cautious liability by his own superiors and later historians. By analyzing the primary documents, we can separate genuine operational failures from the terrifying constraints of early carrier warfare. But before anyone can fairly judge that infamous decision to pull back from the beaches of Guadalcanal, the clock must be rewound. We first have to face the seemingly impossible strategic reality he inherited just a few months earlier, at a moment when the striking power of the United States Pacific Fleet was practically non-existent. In the early months of 1942, the United States Navy was bleeding to death. The battleships that had formed the undisputed backbone of American maritime dominance lay resting in the mud and burning oil of Pearl Harbor. The defensive perimeter spanning the Pacific had completely shattered. Wake Island had fallen. Guam was overrun. The Philippines were collapsing. All that stood between the sprawling, victorious might of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the completely undefended shores of the American West Coast were a handful of fragile, irreplaceable aircraft carriers. Thrust into command of this desperately thin vanguard was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Crucially, Fletcher was not a naval aviator. He was a traditional surface ship sailor, a veteran whose entire military career had been forged on the steel decks of cruisers and destroyers. Now he was tasked with leading a revolutionary weapon system into a type of combat that no navy on Earth had ever actually fought. Carrier versus carrier warfare was entirely theoretical. There were no textbooks. There was no proven doctrine. Every time his pilots left the flight deck of the USS Yorktown, they were essentially conducting live experiments in a deeply unforgiving environment. To understand the immense psychological weight resting on Fletcher's shoulders, one must understand the absolute technological and logistical terror of navigating the South Pacific in early 1942. The ships under his command lacked the sophisticated combat information centers that would coordinate fleet defenses later in the war. The early CXAM radar sets mounted on American masts were rudimentary and notoriously temperamental, often failing entirely or struggling to distinguish between a flock of seabirds and an incoming squadron of enemy torpedo bombers. Ship-to-ship communication relied on highly vulnerable flashing lights or easily intercepted static-filled radio transmissions. But the ultimate, unyielding dictator of every single tactical decision Fletcher made was a logistical reality rarely mentioned in heroic post-war memoirs: fuel. An aircraft carrier task force relied entirely on its protective screen of destroyers to hunt enemy submarines. These smaller warships burned through their fuel bunkers at an alarming rate while zigzagging across the ocean. Refueling at sea in 1942 was a clumsy, agonizingly slow, and highly dangerous maneuver. It required the fleet to drop speed and sail in straight, predictable lines, turning billion-dollar assets into sitting ducks for Japanese torpedoes. A task force running critically low on black oil was effectively paralyzed. A single empty tank meant disaster. While Fletcher grappled with these terrifying operational realities on the open water, his orders were being dictated from a secure office in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away from the nearest Japanese zero. At the absolute top of the naval hierarchy sat Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. King was notoriously brilliant, profoundly abrasive, and relentlessly aggressive. He demanded immediate offensive action. Looking at vast, clean maps in the Navy Department, King expected his commanders to constantly strike the Japanese Empire, disrupt their expansion, and hold the Pacific Line at all costs. To King, any hesitation, any tactical withdrawal to refuel looked like a failure of nerve. The conflict between Washington and the flag bridge of Fletcher's command ship was structural, severe, and utterly irreconcilable. King demanded blind, relentless aggression. But King also issued a terrifying, contradictory caveat. The American carriers could not, under any circumstances, be lost. They were the entire fleet. If Fletcher took a hyper-aggressive gamble to satisfy Washington, and his flight decks were sent to the bottom as a result, there was no reserve force waiting in California. The war in the Pacific would effectively be lost before American industry could even begin to rearm. Fletcher was forced to walk an impossible strategic tightrope. Every hour of every day, he had to weigh the strict, aggressive demands of his superiors against the horrific, practical math of the Pacific Ocean. He was operating in an intelligence vacuum, hunting an enemy that had not lost a naval engagement in 50 years, all while burdened with preserving the only strategic asset the United States had left. This precarious balancing act, the demand for aggressive tactical victories without any tolerance for strategic losses, could only hold for so long. The tension between the rigid expectations of the high command and the fluid, chaotic reality of early carrier combat was fundamentally unsustainable. And by May of 1942, as the Japanese war machine pivoted south to sever the vital supply lines to Australia, that fragile tightrope finally snapped, forcing Fletcher into a completely unprecedented, terrifying new dimension of naval warfare. In early May 1942, that unprecedented dimension materialized in the Coral Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched a major amphibious offensive to seize Port Moresby, a critical stronghold in New Guinea that would position their bombers to directly threaten the Australian mainland. Fletcher moved his two available flight decks, the Yorktown and the massive Lexington, into the shipping lanes to intercept. What followed was a historical first, a naval engagement where the opposing surface fleets never actually sighted each other. For 2 chaotic days, combat was waged entirely in the skies by strike aircraft launched from decks separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. It was a blind, brutal exchange of over-the-horizon strikes. Fletcher's aviators successfully drew blood, sinking the Japanese light carrier Shoho and heavily damaging the fleet carrier Shokaku. Stripped of sufficient air cover, the invasion force bound for Port Moresby was forced to turn back. It was a massive strategic triumph. For the first time in the entire war, a Japanese expansionist advance had been decisively halted. But the cost of this untested warfare was staggering. On May 8th, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes slipped through the rudimentary American defense screens, swarming the Lexington. Despite frantic evasive maneuvers, the gigantic vessel absorbed multiple hits. Hours later, accumulated aviation fuel vapors ignited deep within her hull, triggering a series of catastrophic internal explosions. One of the largest warships in the United States Navy had to be abandoned and sent to the bottom. The physical realization of how easily a heavily armored fleet carrier could be erased from the ocean was profoundly shocking. To Admiral King and armchair critics back in Washington, the burning hulk of the Lexington was viewed not as a necessary sacrifice in a strategic victory, but as a consequence of Fletcher's perceived tactical hesitation. They saw a commander who lacked a killer instinct. Yet, the reality on the water was entirely different. Fletcher had just survived the first carrier duel in human history, and as the battered Japanese forces retreated north, the Imperial High Command was about to discover that this supposedly timid admiral was a far more lethal opponent than anyone had calculated. Less than 4 weeks after the fires of the Coral Sea, the supposedly timid admiral found himself holding the fate of the entire Pacific theater in his hands. The Japanese combined fleet was steaming toward the Midway atoll, intending to draw out and annihilate the remnants of the American Navy. But the Imperial High Command was sailing blindly into a mathematically precise ambush. American cryptanalysts, in a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, had shattered the Japanese naval codes, delivering the exact timetable and coordinates of the impending strike. Armed with this unprecedented intelligence, Fletcher navigated his hastily patched flagship, the USS Yorktown, to a designated coordinate northeast of the atoll, known simply as Point Luck. He was in overall tactical command of a desperately outnumbered force. The tension on the flag bridge was suffocating. Operating under absolute radio silence, Fletcher had to position his forces perfectly. If the cryptanalysts were wrong, or if Japanese scout planes pierced the cloud cover and sighted the American task forces first, the United States Pacific Fleet would cease to exist. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, based on a fragmented contact report from a patrol plane, Fletcher made a highly calculated operational gamble. He authorized the launch of his strike aircraft, sending them toward the estimated position of the Japanese carriers, while simultaneously keeping a reserve force on his own decks to defend against counterattacks. It was a masterpiece of controlled aggression. Within hours, American dive bombers shattered the myth of Japanese maritime invincibility. In a breathtakingly violent span of just 5 minutes, 3 Imperial aircraft carriers were transformed into burning steel coffins. But the unforgiving nature of early carrier warfare guaranteed a brutal physical cost. A surviving Japanese carrier launched a desperate counterstrike, and their veteran pilots followed the returning American planes straight back to Fletcher's flagship. The assault on the Yorktown was terrifyingly precise. Japanese dive bombers plunged through the anti-aircraft fire, scoring 3 devastating direct hits. One bomb penetrated deep into the ship's engineering spaces, instantly extinguishing the boilers and severing the electrical power. The massive carrier shuddered and went dead in the water, billowing thick black smoke into the Pacific sky. For a fleet commander in 1942, losing a flagship in the middle of a massive naval engagement was a nightmare scenario. His radio transmitters were destroyed. His radar screens went dark. He was entirely blind and effectively muted. In the chaos of the burning flight deck, Fletcher executed a grim emergency protocol. He ordered his staff to evacuate the crippled carrier, climbing down ropes into a tossing, motorized whaleboat amidst a slick of heavy bunker oil. He transferred his command flag to the heavy cruiser USS Astoria. This physical transfer of command in the middle of a raging battle is a logistical trauma completely glossed over in popular retellings. It required Fletcher to re-establish control of 2 separate task forces using a cruiser's inferior communication suite, all while coordinating the final, lethal strike against the 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu. By sunset, Fletcher had overseen the total destruction of the primary offensive weapon of the Japanese Empire. He absorbed the enemy's heaviest blows, maintained his tactical composure under extreme duress, and secured one of the most stunning naval victories in human history. Across the ocean, inside the staterooms of the Japanese High Command, the scale of the disaster at Midway induced a state of absolute, paralyzing shock. The rigid timetables and meticulously engineered expansion plans of the Empire had been pulverized in a single afternoon. Prior to June, the Imperial Japanese Navy operated under a pervasive assumption of their own supreme martial superiority. They had severely underestimated the psychological resilience of the American command structure, casually dismissing leaders like Fletcher as weak and predictable. Now, they were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The strategic catastrophe for Tokyo was not merely the loss of 4 irreplaceable flight decks. It was the catastrophic hemorrhage of their most precious military asset, their veteran naval aviators. The Japanese pre-war training pipeline was notoriously rigid, designed to produce a small, elite cadre of pilots rather than a massive, interchangeable force. The men who went down with the flaming flight decks at Midway possessed thousands of hours of flight experience, mastering the complex geometry of aerial torpedo attacks and precision bombing. They were entirely irreplaceable. The Japanese command suddenly realized they were bleeding out their elite offensive spearhead against an opponent who systematically absorbed their strikes and countered with devastating lethality. Yet, the unforgiving pace of the Pacific War offered no time for reflection. Barely 2 months later, in August 1942, the brutal arithmetic of carrier combat violently resurrected itself during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese High Command, desperate to reinforce their embattled garrison in the South Pacific, sent a heavily escorted troop convoy toward the islands, baiting the American fleet with their own aircraft carriers. Once again, Fletcher found himself on a flag bridge, tasked with intercepting an Imperial armada. And once again, the fundamental nature of the engagement revolved around a terrifying exchange of blind, over-the-horizon airstrikes. Fletcher's aviators struck first, locating and sinking the Japanese light carrier Ryujo. But the Japanese counterblow was massive and ruthlessly coordinated. A swarm of enemy dive bombers bypassed the American fighter patrols and plummeted toward the USS Enterprise. The resulting attack was a harrowing demonstration of the sheer destructive power directed at Fletcher's command. The Enterprise absorbed 3 catastrophic bomb hits. One detonated on the flight deck, killing dozens of sailors instantly and starting raging aviation fuel fires. Another penetrated the steel decking, exploding in the gun gallery. The carrier's steering gear jammed, forcing the massive vessel into a helpless, continuous right turn, highly vulnerable to a follow-up torpedo strike. Fletcher was forced to make a split-second, agonizing calculation. His primary striking asset was heavily damaged, his fighter squadrons were severely depleted, and the sun was beginning to set, meaning any further engagements would become a chaotic melee in the dark. Confronted with the potential loss of another irreplaceable fleet carrier, Fletcher made the strict operational decision to break contact and withdraw his task force southward. He pulled his heavily damaged ships out of the combat zone to refuel and repair. The Japanese, having taken their own severe losses and lacking the air cover to protect their troop transports, were forced to abort their reinforcement mission and turn back. By any objective logistical metric, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons was another undeniable strategic victory for Fletcher. He successfully shielded the American beachhead, turned back the reinforcement convoy, and preserved his damaged but surviving aircraft carrier. He played the exact hand he was dealt with cold, mathematical precision. But thousands of miles away, in the pristine corridors of the Navy Department in Washington, D.C., this calculated preservation of the fleet was not viewed as a masterpiece of operational management. It was viewed as a glaring character flaw. When the after-action reports from the Eastern Solomons landed on the desk of Admiral Ernest J. King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, the reaction was one of boiling frustration. King and his senior staff were entirely insulated from the blinding terror of a dive bomber attack and the sickening reality of a burning flight deck. Looking at sweeping strategic maps, they operated purely on an ideology of relentless, unyielding aggression. They demanded commanders who would close with the enemy and destroy them, regardless of the tactical cost. In the eyes of Washington, Fletcher's decision to withdraw the Enterprise after absorbing hits was infuriating. They did not see a commander executing the agonizing tightrope act of fighting an offensive war without a safety net of replacement ships. Instead, they saw a deeply troubling pattern of behavior. At the Coral Sea, he had lost the Lexington. At Midway, he had lost the Yorktown. And now, at the Eastern Solomons, he had retreated, rather than pursuing the fleeing Japanese fleet for total annihilation. A toxic narrative crystallized within the highest echelons of the Navy. Admiral King's staff increasingly whispered that Fletcher, a traditional surface warfare officer, simply lacked the aggressive, killer instinct required for carrier aviation. They completely disregarded the grim logistical data meticulously logged by Fletcher's quartermasters. They ignored the fact that his destroyers were routinely scraping the absolute bottom of their fuel bunkers, heavily compromising their ability to hunt enemy submarines. They dismissed the rudimentary nature of the early radar sets that made night engagements equivalent to operational suicide. Washington wanted a brawling street fighter. Fletcher was giving them a calculated chess master who refused to sacrifice his most vital pieces. This profound disconnect between the sterile, demanding environment of the High Command and the bloody, fuel-starved reality of the South Pacific created an incredibly dangerous friction. Fletcher was winning the most pivotal battles of the 20th century, systematically dismantling the offensive capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy, yet he was rapidly losing the political war within his own command structure. Every time he made a sound mathematical decision to preserve his irreplaceable ships, he inadvertently fed the growing perception that he was a timid, overly cautious liability. He was a man caught in an inescapable operational vice. The pressure of commanding the sole defensive shield of the United States was compounding daily, amplified by a toxic lack of support from the very men who had assigned him the impossible task. This simmering, irreconcilable tension between Washington's blind demand for aggression and Fletcher's grim logistical reality was rapidly approaching a critical mass, and it would finally, inevitably explode over the vulnerable, blood-soaked beaches of Guadalcanal. The breaking point arrived with the amphibious assault on Guadalcanal. For decades, the narrative of this operation has been dominated by the furious accusations of Marine ground commanders. When Fletcher ordered his carriers to withdraw, just 36 hours after the initial landings, those officers believed they were utterly abandoned. They watched their air cover vanish, leaving thousands exposed on a hostile beachhead. Post-war mythology eagerly seized on this, cementing the image of a cowardly admiral fleeing at the first sign of friction. But that simplistic story fractures completely when examining the actual logistical data from that specific weekend. Primary operational logs reveal a terrifying mathematical reality that men on the beach could not see. Fletcher's task force was running critically low on fuel. His escort destroyers were scraping the bottom of their bunkers, severely compromising the fleet's anti-submarine screen. Furthermore, in just a day and a half of sustained combat, he had already lost 20% of his fighter aircraft. To remain off the coast meant anchoring the Navy's last operational flight decks in a static, predictable defensive box. It was a literal death trap, perfectly positioned for Japanese land-based torpedo bombers flying out of Rabaul. Fletcher was trapped in an agonizing moral void. He had to weigh the immediate survival of the exposed Marines against the cold, undeniable certainty that if his carriers were sunk in a stationary posture, the entire Pacific Fleet would cease to exist. He made the deeply unpopular, brutally calculated choice to save the ships. But by doing so, he handed his political enemies in Washington the exact physical excuse they had been waiting for. The final catalyst for his removal arrived just weeks later in a notoriously lethal stretch of ocean southeast of the Solomon Islands, known to American sailors as Torpedo Junction. On the morning of August 31st, 1942, the relentless math of the Pacific finally caught up with the fleet. A Japanese submarine, the I-26, slipped through the depleted destroyer screen and fired a spread of torpedoes directly at Fletcher's flagship, the USS Saratoga. A single torpedo slammed into the carrier's hull. The massive detonation did not sink the vessel, but it severed vital electrical systems, crippled her propulsion, and guaranteed the ship would be out of the war for months in a Pearl Harbor dry dock. During the violent blast, Admiral Fletcher was thrown against a steel bulkhead, suffering a minor gash to his head. It was a highly superficial wound, but in Washington, it was exactly the administrative weapon Admiral Ernest King needed. King could not simply fire the victor of the Coral Sea and Midway without triggering a catastrophic public relations crisis. Instead, he executed a quiet, brutal bureaucratic coup. Citing the torpedo strike and the admiral's slight physical injury, King ordered Fletcher back to the United States for a mandatory period of rest. It was a thinly disguised exile. Fletcher was permanently relieved of tactical sea command. His meticulously managed task forces were handed over to admirals who fit King's preferred mold of relentless, unyielding aggression, commanders who would soon steer their own ships into devastating, profoundly costly brawls in those exact same waters. The quiet removal of Frank Jack Fletcher marked the end of the Navy's most desperate era. The man who had held the line when the Pacific Fleet was at its absolute weakest, the commander who had systematically absorbed the heaviest blows of the Japanese Empire and preserved the only American flight decks in existence, was unceremoniously banished to shore duty. He was stripped of his voice on the front lines, leaving his historical legacy completely defenseless, effectively handing the narrative of his entire career over to the very critics who had just engineered his downfall. After the Second World War concluded, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher made a final decision that permanently sealed his fate in the history books. He remained completely silent. While his contemporaries eagerly published sanitized, heroic memoirs, Fletcher flatly refused to publicly defend his tactical choices or engage in post-war political infighting. This stoic silence handed a blank canvas to Admiral King's loyalists and hostile historians, allowing them to dictate his legacy. For decades, he was comfortably painted as the timid commander who panicked under pressure and nearly lost Guadalcanal. But when stripped of political bias and examined through the cold, unforgiving logistics of 1942, that infamous withdrawal stands not as a failure of nerve, but as a ruthless mathematical calculation of risk versus reward. Fletcher recognized what the aggressively optimistic staff in Washington refused to accept. His primary duty was not to achieve immediate, glorious annihilation of the enemy at the cost of his own flight decks. His duty was to preserve the irreplaceable core of the Pacific Fleet during its most dangerously vulnerable months. By refusing to gamble his surviving ships in static defense, he bought the exact amount of time required for American shipyards to churn out the unstoppable armada of Essex-class carriers. He sacrificed his own reputation to keep the United States Navy afloat. And this historical injustice brings us to a fundamental truth about how we remember the war. History will always prefer a fearless hero who charges blindly into the fire, offering up a comforting myth of unyielding aggression and total victory. We naturally want to celebrate commanders who risk absolutely everything on a single, glorious roll of the dice. But the brutal, unforgiving reality of 1942 demanded a much heavier burden. Ultimately, the Pacific War was not won by a reckless brawler. It was actually saved by an admiral brave enough to retreat.